In the heart of the land, beyond the rolling hills and beneath the golden sun, lay the village of Oloro, a place of bountiful harvests and joyous songs. The air smelled of roasted plantains and fresh palm wine, and the rivers ran so clear that the gods themselves could see their reflections upon the water. And there, among the people of Olorun, lived Ekendu, a warrior of great strength and an even greater heart. He was tall and broad shouldered, with deep brown skin marked by tribal scars, the sign of a warrior who had defended his people time and time again. But there was only one person he loved more than his peer, his sister, Inya. Inya was no longer a child, but a beautiful 19-year-old maiden, full of life and spirit. Her dark brown skin glowed like polished mahogany under the sun. Her tight, curled hair, styled and adorned with cowrie shells. Her bright, expressive eyes were full of mischief. Her smile as radiant as the first morning light. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her colorful wrapper hugging her slender frame, beads jingling softly with every step. One day, I would be a warrior like you, Ekendu, she said, spinning a wooden spear in her hands, her laughter ringing through the air. Ekendu chuckled, resting a strong hand on her shoulder. No, little one day I would make sure you never have to fight. Their grandmother, an elderly woman wrapped in a deep indigo cloth, sat nearby, weaving a raffia basket with hands worn by time but steady with wisdom. She had raised them both after their mother had been taken by the gods. Her gray hair picked from beneath a patterned headscarf, her wise eyes watching over them with so much love. But promises meant nothing to fate. One night, the sky turned red with fire. The Shadow King's warriors had come. Like a swarm of locusts, they descended upon Oloru, cutting down warriors and burning homes. Ekendu fought, fierce, unstoppable, his blade tore through enemies, his muzzles burned with effort, but there were too many. He found Nya, hiding, her hands clutching her fabric in terror. Run, their grandmother urged, her voice heavy with finality. Ekendu did not run. He fought until he could no longer stand. He fought until the darkness claimed him. By dawn, Oloro was nothing but ash. With his wounded body, he carried his sister through the smoldering ruins, their home nothing more than a graveyard of broken spears and fallen warriors. For weeks they traveled, through forests thick with ancient spirits, across rivers that whispered their names, until at last they reached Mugo, the land of Ekendu's grandmother, ruled by the one they feared the most, the Shadow King. The kingdom of the Shadow King was unlike any other. Towering wooden gates loomed over them, carved with symbols of gods long forgotten. Inside the market bustled, traders selling yam, kola nuts, hand-woven clothes, and even the bones of fallen warriors. And beyond it all stood the Shadow King's palace, majestic, monstrous, a fortress of dark power. They say the Shadow King cannot die, whispered an elder by the fire one night. They say he drinks the blood of warriors. To defy him is to be swallowed by the darkness. Ekendu cared for none of it. He had no home, no fight left in him. For the sake of his sister and grandmother, he laid down his sword and became a simple farmer. For a time, peace returned. until it was stolen from him once more. One morning, they came for Nya. Soldiers stood at their doorstep, their red and ceremonial gold robes shimmering in the sun. By the order of the Shadow King, the girl Unya is to be taken as his bride. Ekendu's blood ran cold. His grandmother's frail hands gripped his arm, pleading, "Do not fight, my son. We cannot lose you too." But how could he not fight? How could he watch his little sister, the light of his life, be dragged into the abyss by the very monster who had already taken everything from them? Ekendu sharpened his sword. He marched to the palace, and he did what no man had ever dared to do. He challenged the Shadow King. Inside the palace, the Shadow King sat upon his throne, a massive plus-sized figure wrapped in black and gold robes. His fingers adorned with heavy rings of power. The air smelled of roasted meat and overflowing wine, and all around him, women danced, guards feasted, and the kingdom bowed. The king's piercing eyes settled on Ekendu, amused. "You would challenge me," he said, his voice as deep as thunder. "Do you know what it takes to defeat the Shadow King?" "Very well, warrior," he said, licking his lips. "You shall have your chance, but if you fail..." His gaze shifted to Nya sitting at his footstool. "She will be my bride, and you will be my dinner." Ekendu's grip tightened around his spear. He did not respond. There was nothing to say. The Shadow King raised his hand. "The first trial begins at dawn," he said. The first trial, which was called the Path of the Dead, had begun. Ekendu was led to the sacred forest, where no man had walked and returned alive. The trees twisted like skeletal figures, their bark covered in strange carvings. The air was thick and damp, and heavy with the scent of earth, decay, and something else. A priestess, old and hunched, stepped forward, her eyes clouded with white mist, her skin painted with sacred symbols. "To walk the path of the dead," she said, "is to meet the ones who hunger for the living." Ekendu stepped forward. He walked. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, faces he recognized, his fallen brothers, his father, his mother, his grandmother. "Ekendu," their voices whispered, "stay with us, the world has forgotten you." He clenched his fist, forcing himself forward. A hand, cold, lifeless, clutched his arm. He turned. There, standing before him, was Nya, her body pale, her eyes lifeless. "Brother, you have failed me." Ekendu closed his eyes. "This is not real." He gritted his teeth and tore himself away from the phantoms, sprinting forward until the forest darkness broke into light. He had passed the first trial. After the first trial had ended, the people of Mugo began to wonder if a young man could really save them from their tyrant king. The second trial had begun, as it was called the Pit of Spirits, a chasm of lost souls whispering madness to those who dared to cross. The bridge was narrow, the spirits vengeful, but Ekendu's heart held firm, his mind sharper than fear itself. He had successfully crossed the bridge, and he had passed the second trial. Tension had risen around the kingdom. The final trial was not a game but a battle. Even Ekendu's heart pounded like drums. The king smiled. You have passed 2 trials, he said. But now you must fight me. If you win, you will take your sister. If you lose, you both belong to me. Ekendu held his spear tightly. He was tired, bruised, but ready. The Shadow King stood up. He was huge, his belly round, his arm thick like tree trunks. His robes flowed like black smoke, and when he stepped forward, darkness spread across the room like a living thing. With a loud roar, the king raised his hands, and suddenly black figures rose from the shadows. They were warriors made of darkness, tall and thin, their red eyes glowing like fire. They held long, sharp swords and surrounded Ekendu. Inya, still tied up, gasped in fear. You cannot win, the king said, laughing. These warriors are made of shadows. You can cut them, but they will never die. The shadow warriors attacked. Ekendu fought bravely. He dodged, jumped, and struck with his spear. But no matter how many times he hit the shadow warriors, they did not fall. They just rose again, laughing silently, their glowing eyes watching him. For the first time, Ekendu felt fear. How do I fight shadows? He thought. Then a soft voice whispered in his ear, shadows can only live in darkness. Bring the light, my son. It was his grandmother's voice. Ekendu looked around. Then he saw it, the torches on the wall, the only light in the room. With one kick, he knocked down a torch. It hit the ground and fire spread. The shadows screamed. They are twisted and shrank, trying to escape the light. One by one, they disappeared. The Shadow King's smile vanished. No, he roared, stepping back. Ekendu did not wait. He rushed forward, lifted his spear, and struck right into the king's chest. The Shadow King's body shook. Black smoke poured from his mouth. His skin cracked like dry wood. This cannot be, he whispered as he fell on the floor. Ekendu staggered back, his body aching, his heart pounding. Inya, still bound, sighed in relief, tears welling in her eyes. The palace guards and concubines who had covered in the shadows began to creep forward, their faces filled with hope. But then the air shifted. A deep laugh rumbled through the room, making the walls tremble. Ekendu's eyes widened in horror as the Shadow King's body began to move. His chest swelled, the spear still inside him, but instead of falling, he rose to his feet. Only now he was twice his original size. His body stretched unnaturally, his skin splitting open like cracked earth, revealing pure darkness beneath. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now burned like twin suns. His black robes twisted and shifted like living smoke, growing heavier, darker, swallowing the light around him. The hall grew colder, the torches flickering weakly. You fool, the Shadow King's voice boomed, echoing through the palace. Did you think a mere spear could end me? He clenched his massive fist. The walls trembled. Ekendu stepped back, gripping his spear tightly, his breath unsteady. The Shadow King lifted his arms, and suddenly the torches in the palace went out one by one. Darkness swallowed the room. Long ago, I made a vow to a demon, the king said. I sacrificed my own mother in exchange for immortality. Iya gasped, horrified. I cannot die, the king roared. With one monstrous swing of his hand, he knocked Ekundu across the room. Ekundu crashing into a pillar, his body wrecked with pain, his vision blurred, his strength failing. For the first time in his life, he felt hopeless. The Shadow King stalked forward, his enormous form blotting out the faint light that remained. He raised his massive foot, ready to crush Ekundu where he lay. Nya screamed, "No!" But just as the king's foot came down, a powerful wind rolled through the hall. Golden light burst from the ground, encircling Ekundu. A chorus of deep voices echoed through the chamber, voices filled with power, voices that commanded the earth itself. Ekundu's pain melted away. His body felt light, strong, invincible. He looked up and saw them, the ancestors. They stood around him, tall and proud, their bodies glowing with sacred energy. One of them, his great-grandfather, a legendary warrior, stepped forward. "Rise, Ekundu," the ancestor said. "The blood of warriors runs in your veins. You are our son, our chosen one. You will end this." Ekundu felt a surge of power. His wounds closed, his strength returned. His spear, once ordinary, now burned with a golden flame. He rose to his feet. The Shadow King's smile disappeared again. What is this?" he roared. "Impossible!" Ekundu lunged forward, faster than ever before. The king swung at him and missed. Ekundu dodged again, his body moving like the wind. He leaped high, higher than any man should be able to, and with one last earth-shaking roar, he drove his spear right into the Shadow King's forehead. For a moment, time stood still. The Shadow King's body went rigid. His monstrous form trembled. Then fire erupted from within him. Flames poured from his mouth, his eyes, his very skin. He let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream, his body melting into ash. The darkness fled. The palace shook. The walls cracked. Then silence. And with that, the Shadow King was no more. The light returned. The torches blazed again. The palace doors flung open, sunlight flooding in. The people fell to their knees, weeping with joy. Nya rushed forward, throwing herself into Ekundu's arms. "You did it!" she cried. Ekundu held her tight, breathing hard. "It is over," he whispered. And as the golden glow of the ancestors faded, Ekundu looked up to the sky, knowing their spirits would forever watch over him. And there was victory at last. The end of the 3 trials of the Shadow King.